historians. I hope everyone is having a great day today. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War. So what we're going to cover today is three things. Our agenda is, let's talk about first the post-war years. What is happening in the immediate aftermath of World War II that's going to lead into the Cold War. Then we're going to talk about the economic and political systems of the Cold War, and then we're also going to touch on some of the foreign policy about the Cold War. So first, the post-war years. World War II has just ended. So what does this mean for Europe and the world? Well, first off, we need to rebuild. World War II has absolutely devastated countries in Europe, countries in Asia. The economy in these countries, the infrastructure is all just obliterated because of the horrors of World War II. And so, at the end of the war, it's up to three men to try to put the world back together and try to prevent something like this from ever happening again. So, President Truman in the U.S., Churchill in the UK, and Stalin in the USSR. Those are the big three. They are going to be the ones mainly dealing with how we're going to fix the devastation of World War II and make the world better moving forward. However, just because these guys are allies during World War II doesn't mean they agree on everything. There's going to be a lot of conflict over how the world should look. So let's look at some maps. So, if you look at the map on the left, this is how Europe was kind of divided up after World War II. The Soviet Union and the UK and the US, they had very different governmental systems. The USSR is communist, and the US and the UK are capitalist and more democratic, and so those two worldviews don't really mesh when it comes to deciding how these all these new countries that have been created after World War II or that are being rebuilt after World War II about how they should be run. So they decided to kind of split it. And the USSR gains control and influence over these little countries right here. And then the US and the UK, they have influence of all these blue countries. This white line right here, that's what us historians call the Iron Curtain. That separates the blue countries from the red countries, the capitalists from the communists, because these two groups don't get along. And if you look at this map here, this is bigger than just Europe. So you have the US and its allies, this kind of hemisphere of the world here, and Europe, Australia, and then you have the Soviet Union spreading its influence through Eastern Europe and China and parts of Asia. Now, because these two ideologies don't really mesh very well, they're both going to do what they can to stop the spread of the others' ideology. Sorry, guys. So let's talk about what this kind of means, communism versus capitalism. So, communism is typically defined as having a one-party state. In the U.S., we have two parties. We have Republicans and we have Democrats. In a communist society like we're seeing in the USSR, there's one party that controls the government, it controls everything, there's not an opposing party. You're also going to see the government engaging in what we're going to call central planning. So this is where the government is going to control industry, business, agriculture. It's all owned by the state. You don't just decide you want to be a potato farmer. The government tells you you're going to be a potato farmer. No, there's going to be no social classes. In theory, with communism, everyone is equal. There's also going to be a lot of government control and censorship. Whereas if we look at capitalism, the goal of countries like the US and the UK in this time is to guarantee free and fair elections for the countries that were impacted by World War II. We saw in World War II how the aggressors like Hitler took over a lot of countries and imposed their government and their will on those people. So now the US and the UK, Truman and Churchill, they want to guarantee these people free and fair elections so that they can decide what their government looks like. So in a capitalist system, you have these free elections. Usually you're going to have two or more parties. Industry and agriculture are going to be owned by individuals. So if you want to be a potato farmer, that's your own directive. You can own that potato farm. And these things are going to be regulated sometimes by the government. We don't have a perfect capitalist system in America. And so the free market is going to kind of control the prices on things, the supply and demand, things like that. In a capitalist society, you're also going to have different social classes. Not everyone is equal. And you're also going to have more freedom of speech. So if we just want to look at a basic definition of these two things, we have communism, which in its most specific definition is an economic system. But when we're studying the Cold War, we're going to consider it both a political and an economic system that attempts to make everything equal through government control. Whereas with capitalism, you have an economic system with a free market where there's little government intervention. Alright, so the last thing we're going to talk about today is kind of this U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. So what exactly is the U.S. doing to try to make sure that our values of capitalism, of democracy, of freedom, of liberty, what are we doing to make sure that that is what these new countries, these weak countries are leaning to and not communism? So we know that capitalism and communism cannot and do not coexist peacefully. And so you're going to get this really competitive nature, this very strong rivalry between the USSR and the US. And the US does not want the USSR to spread communism throughout the world. And so President Truman comes up with this doctrine, and it's his belief that the US needs to support countries threatened by Soviet force or by communist influence. And this is going to kind of be described, a lot of these policies are going to fall under the idea of containment, where the U.S. is going to actively try to limit or contain Soviet influence. But the Truman Doctrine and containment are both kind of high-level philosophical ideas. So how are we going to actually, physically, legitimately make sure that the USSR cannot spread its influence throughout the whole world? One of the first things we're going to do is implement the Marshall Plan. So under this plan, we're going to provide aid, mostly through money and resources, to Western Europe to help economic redevelopment. Our argument for the Marshall Plan is that if we give money to Western Europe, if we make sure that they are able to rebuild their infrastructure, if they can have elections, if they can build their own governments, they're going to lean democratic and not be communist. So this follows with the theory at the time of the domino theory. So we believe that if one country falls to communism, others near it will too. So if we go back to our maps, our belief was that if some of these countries became communist, it would just be a matter of time before these countries would become communists and these countries would become communists, and all of a sudden we were afraid that the USSR would have control over all of Europe, and we didn't want that. Because the US emerges from World War II with a lot more power than they had going into it. And a lot of that is due to the fact that there wasn't active fighting on U.S. land. And so we don't have a bunch of infrastructure damage. Our government is very much still intact. But these countries in Europe and Asia, they are very fragile right now. And so we don't want the USSR spreading their influence to those countries. Because if one country becomes communist, another will become communist. And like dominoes, when one falls, the rest will follow. And lastly, we have this idea of mutually assured destruction. At the end of World War II, how we got Japan to surrender was by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, once we drop those bombs, the cat's out of the bag, so to say. And everyone knows we have, at this time, what is the biggest, most destructive weapon in the entire world. Obviously, if we have a rival like the USSR, they don't want to just let us have this bomb. They want one of their own, so they're going to start developing their own bomb. But then you have the question of, well, what happens when we have these major bombs and we see all the damage it did to Japan? What happens if we engage in active warfare, a hot war, so to say, and we're using nuclear weapons? all the countries at the time kind of came to the realization and the agreement that if this happened, it would mean the end of the world for everyone involved. Because if you use nuclear weapons by two or more opposing sides, it would cause the annihilation of the attacker and the defender, because these bombs are so powerful. And that's part of the reason why the Cold War stays a Cold War. Now, a hot war is one like World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, where there are two very clear sides and there is active fighting happening. Whereas with the Cold War, you have maybe some proxy wars happening, you have some little scuffles here and there, but there's not active warfare happening. It's really a war of ideology and beliefs. And you're going to see these two countries, the US and the USSR, doing all they can to spread their ideology through as much of the world as they can, and to show that their way of life is the best way of life. And as we move forward, we will see what that looks like. But in order to better understand the culture of the Cold War and why it was so scary for people, even though there wasn't active fighting, we're going to talk a little bit more about mutually assured destruction. So, why did the Cold War stay so cold? I want you guys to watch this clip from one of my favorite movies, Dr. Strangelove, and then answer the short response question at the bottom of your notes. In this clip, you see the American president speaking with the Soviet ambassador about the fictional doomsday machine. And this scene really perfectly represents mutually assured destruction. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope you learned a lot in our lecture today, and we'll see you next time.